We'll wait just a couple of minutes before we start, and perhaps our sustainability coordinator, Kate Irvine, can tell you a little bit about what's going on in sustainable farming. Kate, would you do that?
Sure. Well, Happy New Year, and thanks for coming to our first dialogue of the year. This week will also be our first garden club meeting of the year. It's about It's about keeping chickens in the garden, and this is one of our regular monthly events along with the dialogues. And so you can pick up this flyer if you want, which is about all our monthly events. Currently, we keep our Facebook page quite up to date, so that's a good place to look for all our events, including a Green Crew tree planting event this Saturday. That's where all ages are welcome to come out and plant trees in collaboration with the City of Claremont. So Dave, who's presenting tonight, works very closely with our Green Crew coordinator, Canopy, to figure out which trees go where, and you get to come out and help plant them. And we have a resource center at the Botanic Garden. They're kind enough to donate us an office space, and I'm there Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday mornings. And this morning while I was there, I got information about a few other upcoming events. One is a free film screening, The Real Dirt on Farmer John, and it's being presented by the Center for Process Studies. And also some information about the Los Angeles Community Choice Energy Program. The City of Claremont has agreed to participate in this, and now the cities that are part of this program to come together and try to bring more affordable, sustainable energy to all the residents is looking to form a community advisory committee. Since they're just getting started, they need input as they form the regulations and just, how they proceed from here and starting to get this program going. So that's on Wednesday, January 10th in Duarte at 6:30 p.m. But you can also participate through a webinar. And they also give a phone number, so maybe you can call in and maybe there'll be a group phone call about it. So those are some of the opportunities we have available, and you're always welcome to come to our board meetings, sign up for our email newsletter, and we have a lot of exciting things going on this year. Richard Haskell is our new chair of our board of directors, and he and Freeman Allen are leading our Eco Farm group, which is working and making progress on getting some local community composting and community farming going here in Claremont.
Thank you, Kate. And this evening we're extremely fortunate to have Dave Roger talking to us on pruning, something that we really need to pay attention to at this time of the year. And he's a certified arborist, has been for many years, and he oversees the arborists and the care of Claremont trees. So it's a huge, important responsibility. And with that, I'll just turn it over to Dave, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Freeman. I need to put on the...
Would you rather have the portable one?
Okay, is that working okay? Super, you can all hear me? Wonderful. Glad to be here this evening. I will start out by saying I do have that leftover cough from the flu. That seems to hang on forever and ever, so I will be doing that every so often. It's fun to talk about pruning. I love to prune myself. I spend a lot of time at home doing pruning. So pruning is pretty much we go in and we take a look at a tree or a shrub or something and make some decisions about what we'd like to take out of it, and our reason for taking out of it can vary on a lot of different things. But to begin with, talking about trees in nature really don't need pruning. They take care of themselves. We prune trees for a whole bunch of different other reasons. Probably the biggest thing is really human safety. So if we're talking about people that are in our parks, that are on our streets, around our homes, we want to prune the trees really for safety. We also do a lot of pruning for aesthetics, because not all trees tend to grow as aesthetically pleasing as we would like. So I always say, and I'm not expecting this group to learn about what the biology of trees is, but I kind of want to talk a little bit about it because that's really important when it comes to pruning, because you kind of need to understand every time you make a cut, that tree or that shrub or that plant is going to react to that cut. And kind of understanding what that reaction is going to be is going to help you in making the decisions about where to make the cut. So just kind of generally when we talk about trees, so here we are, we're into the winter. Trees are pretty much, most of them are losing their leaves. And in the spring, so the energy in the tree will be down in the roots. So in the springtime, that energy comes out of the roots, up through the trunk of the tree and in, and the buds swell, the leaves come out, and the tree begins to develop for the season. Of course, we're talking about deciduous trees. In the summertime, the leaves on the tree then, through the process of photosynthesis, grabs the energy from the sun, and they turn the water and nutrients that are in the tree into the carbon, which is the tree's energy, and that carbon gets stored in the trunk and the branches and in the roots. So then again, in the late summer, early fall, that energy that's in the tree then starts going back down into the roots, and that cycle starts all over again. So that's kind of important to know because it kind of impacts what we're doing. I'll say it now, but I'm going to repeat it again. Because the tree starts growing best in the springtime, if we prune now, between now and the beginning of spring, that's when the tree is going to have the most amount of energy to heal over those cuts, to heal the wounds. If you were to trim the tree in the summer you're taking away that foliage that the tree needs for the energy that it is trying to store in its system. So summer is not always the greatest time to prune. Okay, so why do we prune? We prune, as I said before, for risk. We want to minimize any kind of failures we might have in terms of limbs. We talk about resistance to wind and the Santa Ana winds. There's a lot of discussion about how much you take out, which is a whole nother discussion. It improves light penetration. You may have plants down below that you want more sunlight to get on, so you may want to open the tree up for that. You'll notice trees that have really heavy, thick canopies. On the inside, you'll see a lot of dead branches, dead wood, and that's because those branches are no longer getting the sun, so they die. So you may want to open the tree up to keep those inner branches alive. And of course, it can help improve the tree's health. We also may want to look at, changing the size of the tree, looking at the form of the tree, trying to prune to give it better aesthetics. We prune to improve fruit, flower production. And then, of course, we look at trees, limbs, and if they're obstructing things, we do that. And, of course, they can increase the lifespan of a tree. So these are probably the biggest, gotta-dos, the three things that we talk about always when we're pruning. You want to remove any dead branches that are in the tree, any that look like they're dying, and any that might be diseased. And those are the three most important things to do anytime you prune anything. You also want to remove any branches that may be crossing or rubbing, because a branch that continues to rub, as the wind is blowing, that rubs away, it can rub away the bark and get down into the living tissue of the tree, which then opens the tree up for diseases and insects. And then we want to eliminate any weak branches. So we call this, you see in the picture, kind of like a V branch or a codominant stem. So what it is you've got, two branches coming up like this, and you've got bark that's growing in the middle. And as that bark grows, it starts to push the two apart. And I don't know if you've seen trees just kind of split and half the tree will come down. That's usually what ends up happening. So when you have this, the best thing is to get rid of this tight crotch when the tree is really young and it's a sapling. It's easy to recover from it. If the tree is already mature like this one, it's a lot more difficult. But we can talk about that when I get farther along in the presentation. And And I've talked about, eliminating excessive interior growth. One of the things I talk about is water sprouts, and I don't know how well you can see it. This is a jacaranda tree, and if you trim a jacaranda tree too thinly, it's known for putting in these water sprouts or growths. So you see these thin branches that are going straight up into the tree? That's what we call water sprouts, and you'd want to get rid of those. All right, this is important, the effects of pruning. So I mentioned the fact that in the summer, the leaves, they work with photosynthesis in order to create the energy and create the food for the tree. So when you're pruning, anytime you take foliage out of the tree, you're reducing the amount of photosynthesis. Therefore, you're reducing the amount of food or energy that that tree or that plant may have. And that's really important to know. It also can be a reduction in the tree's growth, and it can promote that shoot growth that I showed you in the last picture. So if you talk about reduction in growth, so if you had one of those codominant stemmed branches or trees, if you go in and severely prune one of them, it's going to starve that branch and it's going to reduce its growth. And hopefully the second one is going to take over and become the dominant branch. And that's kind of one way of curing it. It just, again, it depends on the tree, how old the tree is, and how long that's been growing like that. But that is one of the structural opportunities we have to keep a tree from falling apart or from splitting. So when to prune is always an issue. It seems like in Southern California anymore, the best time to prune is now, to prune in the winter. It used to be that we would say that deciduous trees or plants, plants that lose their leaves, the winter's the best time to prune. And in the summer, if it's an evergreen tree or shrub, it was best to prune in the summer. We don't say that any longer because there are so many new diseases and insects out there, and they're all significantly less active in the winter. So we're now saying prune everything in the winter. That being said, you can also, all year long you can go. I mean, if you've got a dead branch or diseased or dying, you can go ahead and remove that anytime during the year because it'll be a benefit to the tree rather than having a negative impact on it. And then I just wanted to bring this up, and there's some brochures that I got from the bird people. Kind of need to be aware of birds and when they're nesting, because we don't want to prune when they're nesting. Different birds nest at different times, but generally late spring, you're going to get most of the nesting with birds, and so you don't want to be pruning during that time. And there's actually laws that protect the birds. You've got California law that protects the birds, and then you have the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So it's important that if you're doing the trimming or you've got someone else doing the trimming and you've got a live nest in the tree, that you wait until the young birds have left the nest to go in and trim. So I mentioned the fact that in the springtime, this time of the year, early spring, is the best time to trim because it's going to heal over faster. And here's some of the pruning tools that you've probably all seen. I think the important thing is having pruners that are scissors type of pruners. You don't want what's called the anvil type where the blade comes down on a metal surface like this, because that crushes the tissue, the plant material tissue. So you don't want one of those. You want a scissors type cut. It'll be a cleaner cut. And that's what I just said. So now we talk about where do we make the cuts. And it's something that we call the branch collar, and you want to prune outside the branch collar. And I've got a whole bunch of different slides on this. But kind of here's an example. So if you don't prune, so here's the branch collar right here, and you want to cut right in front of that. And the reason is so that it can heal over. So if this is left on, you have this dead part, it'll never heal over it. That's open then for disease and insects. The same as here, was sort of topped or lopped off there. This whole branch is dead, and it's just open for problems. So the correct pruning cut. Again, if you understand how nature works, you're talking about the biology of the tree. So you've got the energy going up into the tree, and the energy goes up in what's called the living layer, which is right underneath the bark. When it gets to a branch, it goes around this branch and continues up. So if you make the proper cut, that energy comes up, goes around, continues to go up, and it starts building wood, and it closes over that wound. If you cut the branch collar off, then that disturbs that whole process, and the branch is not able to heal itself. So this is kind of what it looks like in the long run. So, it continues to put on wood, and eventually it encloses wherever that wound is. And trees have the ability that if some decay has started in where the cut is, it's able to wall off that decay. That brings us to talking about how big of a branch do you cut off. We always say don't cut anything that's bigger than 2, maximum 3 inches in diameter. Because if it's bigger than that, it's not going to be able to heal quickly enough to keep decay out of there. Which is kind of talks about why it's important, at least in trees, to trim them when they're young and develop a strong structure when they're young, so you don't have to, at some point, take out a larger limb. So again, this is showing those living layers where the energy is going up and around that branch and developing that wood, which develops that branch collar. And then this kind of gives you an idea. So if we're looking at hardwood trees, the branch collar is actually easier to identify than if you're looking at pine trees where they're harder to find, but that gives you some visuals. And then when we talk about pruning, so if you're taking a branch off that has, let's say it's a 2-inch branch, we always talk about making 3 cuts on the tree. The first one, as you can see there, is underneath the branch. And then the second one, you come out a little bit farther and you cut the entire branch off. And the third one, you're going in and you're making that clean cut right in front of the branch collar. And our reason for doing that is because you don't want it to tear. You don't want the bark to tear. Because the minute the bark tears, now you've created a wound that is very difficult for that tree to recover from. So that's what that undercutting is. You're cutting the bark so that it doesn't rip. Then you're cutting the whole branch off. And then because what you're left with is a small piece of wood that really doesn't weigh anything, so then it's easy to make that nice clean cut without it ripping. So this is just another picture of it. So at this point, any questions on where we make the cuts? All right. And here is just a picture that demonstrates that correct cuts. If you look at trees, you'll see how there's trees that have good cuts are starting to close over as it builds wood over and it closes over that wound. If it's not closing, then you know it hasn't been cut. Right. So sometimes we want to reduce the height on a tree, and it's what we call a reduction cut. And I think the important thing is what it's saying here, that the branch you're cutting it down to needs to be 1/3 of the size of the other branch. So you'll see oftentimes trees get what we call topped, or you'll see somebody cut a branch and say the branch is, this big around, and then you'll see they cut it and left a little twig like this. Well, the branch that's left needs to be able to draw enough energy up in order to heal over that wound. So that's your reason for why we're saying that if a branch is this big, The one you reduce it down to or cut it to has to be a third of the size of that. So there's enough energy flowing up into that branch, and the leaves pull that energy up in order to heal over that cut. So that is really important, and you'll see a lot of pruning now that's not proper, that people are cutting them and leaving these little tiny twigs going out to the side, and it just doesn't heal it over. It's what we would call a topping cut. And this is that picture we had before, just kind of giving you an idea of how you could reduce down the canopy. So, you know, they're saying in here that this branch coming out to the side would be a third in diameter of the one that they're removing up above. So a reduction cut on a mature tree causes more stress actually than thinning the tree out. And since reduction cuts remove the leaders, there's no natural protection zone that you might find between a branch and the trunk. That reminds me of something, you know, another reason for not doing these kind of cuts in the summertime is that the branches will sunburn. I get crazy over it when I see that someone is what we call topped or severely trimmed a tree. Because I'm sensitive to that. When the sun hits the top of my head, because I don't have hair, I sunburn. And if you think about it, trees that have all of these leaves, the leaves are protecting the bark and the branches. You remove a lot of those leaves, that sun's going to come in and it's going to sunburn. And what happens when the bark sunburns, it then begins to crack and separate from the tree, and it has a really negative impact. Okay, so here's another picture kind of showing the reduction cut where they're cutting it to a side branch that's large enough. If you don't make a right cut, then of course the tree can't heal over. So here's that codominant stem that we talked about where you have branches that are pretty much both the same size. And again, as they continue to grow, that bark then gets caught in the middle and will eventually push them apart. You'll lose one or the other of the branches. So so if the tree is young, you want to reduce that. You want to get rid of that codominant stem. Here's one that's even tighter. Kind of like, if you think about it, a 45-degree angle is probably best for a branch coming off of a trunk. If it's much tighter than that, then you need to worry about that included bark. So there's some more pictures of just tight angles where you can kind of see probably this one more than that one. See where that bark is just starting to bunch up. And then we get into, no, we don't top trees. And why don't we top trees? Well, one thing is you get all of these sprouts that'll come off of what we call a topping cut. And if you think about it, I kind of go like this and say, okay, if I've topped the tree and I've got this sprout that's coming out of the side, the sprout is hanging onto that branch like this. And when it gets long enough and you get a strong enough wind, it just peels right off. It's not able to build enough wood to really attach itself with a lot of strength. That's one of our reasons for why we don't top, because it weakens the tree in the long run. You have a lot of branch failures from it, and a lot of decay can set in. Some trees are more tolerant than other trees, but eventually it can create quite a problem with decay. So why do we say we don't top? Well, one is could starve the tree. We talked about photosynthesis. It's a shock to the tree. Some trees get just shocked and never come back out of it. Insects and diseases get in there. The new growth that's come on, it's rapid, it's weak. Some trees die, and of course, lots of us think it's ugly. And in the long run, it becomes more expensive because then you're pruning more frequently in order to keep the tree safe. And of course, they can be a hazard, as I said. Those branches can then easily break off the tree when they get to be too heavy if it's a topping from a topping cut. The other thing we don't do is what's called lion tailing, where you thin and take everything out that's in the middle of the tree and you go up the branches and you just leave a little bit of greenery on the end. That really unbalances the tree. Besides draining the tree of its energy, there's some good videos that actually show how if a strong wind hits a tree, those inner branches on the inside cause that wind to swirl, and the wind will swirl around and actually kind of mitigate the power of the wind as it leaves the tree. If you really open it up, that wind hits it and the tree just bends and oftentimes can break. So those inner branches actually do help mitigate strong winds. All right, let's kind of get into talking about pruning different trees of different ages. Do we have any questions at this point?
Yes. I think I remember you saying at one point that when you look at a tree, you tend to think 10% maximum trim pruning. Are you getting to that? Or?
I'm getting to that. No, that's okay. Because we're going to talk about young trees, and young trees they can tolerate up to almost 50%, as you can see, taken off the tree, because they're young, they're energetic, they can heal themselves really fast. And so if you take a young tree, I keep saying I want to take a group to the entrance to the wilderness park, those coast live oak trees. They're so sad. I keep wanting to do a pruning demonstration there, because we would go in and probably take out 50% of the material in order to get them some decent structure. So when the tree is young, it's really important to try and build that structure, and you can take a lot of material out of it, but in the long run, you're going to have a stronger, healthier tree. Adult trees, however, they're a lot slower growing, and they need that energy to fight diseases, insects, that kind of thing. So we say 10-15% is the max you want to take out of the tree. Whereas mature trees, you really don't want to take anything out of the tree. They grow very slowly. They start to reduce in size. So the thing about mature or older trees is that 75% of the energy that they produce through photosynthesis is used just to maintain itself. And the other 25% it needs to fight off disease, insects, anything else that's going on. So if you take any live foliage out of an old tree, you're really jeopardizing its longevity. So it's just, again, mature trees, if there's dead wood in it, that's what you want to get rid of. Diseased wood, you want to get rid of it, but otherwise you don't want to take any live foliage out of a mature tree. What this 25% is because the International Society of Arboriculture has a standard that says don't take any more than 25% out of the tree. So I put this in here because people say, well, that's what they say. Well, that's an average, number one. Number two, that really addresses trees more that are on the East Coast versus the trees on the West Coast. So while they say no more than 25%, out here we say no more than 10 or 15%. And I just put a little bit in about shrub pruning. It drives me crazy to see shrubs that are pruned into balls and boxes and squares and that sort of thing. And I will say that we are having a real battle with our new contractor that's maintaining the medians. And they're replacing a lot of plant material that they have done that to. That's all I'm willing to say about it. But shrubs, if you prune them right, i.e. their natural form, it really doesn't take a lot of trimming. So there's a couple of things. One, if you take a hedge trimmer and you trim off the top of a shrub, you're making hundreds of little cuts. Each one of those little cuts is going to spur growth in that shrub. So then you have more to trim. And if you're environmentally conscious, you don't want to be producing a lot of green waste. You want minimal amount. So if you prune them according to their natural shape or form, you're not going to have as much green waste. You're not going to have as much growth. It also then gets into, what is the ultimate height of that shrub? And I laugh when people, say, well, what would you plant under the window here? How about a hibiscus? And I go, no, that gets to be 20 feet tall. Your window is, 3.5 feet off the ground. So you look at what is the space that shrub goes in, and find a shrub whose maximum height is 2.5 feet or 3 feet, because you don't want to be doing all of that pruning. Okay. Oh, any questions on the shrub thing? I just threw that in for a little. Okay. So there's different types of pruning that we talk about. So structural pruning is pretty much when we focus on young trees. Crown thinning, we want to reduce the amount of foliage that's in the tree. Crown thinning is getting rid of those 3Ds that I talked about, your dead, dying, and diseased branches. Crown reduction is when we need to reduce the height of the tree, and crown restoration is when, let's say, the tree's been damaged from a storm and a significant branch or two have come out of the tree. You need to go in and do some corrective pruning to try and restore it back to good structure. Or we can also take a tree that's been topped in the past and over time structurally prune the tree or do this restoration pruning to eventually get it into being a stronger tree. So structural pruning is kind of the arrangement of the stems and the branches on the tree. Depending on the tree and its growth habit, you kind of look at it and say, all right, I want one main dominant trunk, and then I want to space the branches out. I don't want the branches too close together because I'm thinking about what's the ultimate size, the ultimate shape of that tree. Again, eliminate those cross branchings and the upright branches. One of the things on young trees is, if you say you've got a young tree and you go, okay, this is going to be in my lawn, and I need to mow underneath it, so I want that tree, at least to be this high. Well, you don't take a young tree and prune off all the branches so it's this high. You leave the lower branches on, but you cut them back. You would what I would call stub them back, and the reason is because those lower branches are feeding the trunk, and you need that trunk to grow and you need that trunk to develop. So this kind of gives you an idea of structural pruning on a young tree. So it looks like, I don't know why I didn't bring my pointer tonight, but anyway. So it looks like it had 2 leaders, double leaders on it. So they're pruning one off there to get rid of that double leader. They've got branches like this one that's crossing, and they're taking care of that. Here's some inner branches that they want more spacing between the branches for the structure of it. So it kind of gives you an idea of what they're doing. You got the water sprouts at the bottom that they're getting rid of. These are the temporary branches that I talked about that you want to reduce the lengths of them on so they continue to feed the trunk. All right, adult tree pruning, maintain the dominant trunk. We want to shorten any aggressive branches. Shorten temporary branches, as we talked about. You want to space the main branches 18 to 36 inches apart. Eliminate those 3Ds. You don't want rubbing or touching or crossing branches. And any possible included bark, those branches that are too close together. And you kind of want to direct the growth to fill in the gaps in the canopy. So the directed growth is when I mentioned or talked about in the beginning, that every time you make a cut, the tree or the plant is going to react in a certain way. So I don't know that this is going to show anything. Roses are a lot easier. So I've got this branch coming up, and so let's say this is the tall leader, but I want to reduce the height of it. So I want to take it down. So I would take it down to here, if you can see, because the energy is going to go into this branch and the branch is going to go to the outside. If I was to reduce it to the branch, the lower branch under it, that branch is then growing into the tree, and you don't want the branch to grow in, so you want the structure to open up. So that's what I mean by wherever you make that cut, the energy is going to go into that branch that you're cutting it to, and think about, okay, what direction is that branch going to grow in, and is that the direction I want it to go? So thinning is a most common thing we do with trees, kind of reduce the density of the crown, especially when we're in strong wind areas. It can reduce stress on the limbs due to gravity. There are some trees that if you look at them, the one that comes to mind is the Aleppo pine or the Afghan pine. I don't know if you're familiar with it. They're the ones that are up on Claremont Boulevard. But for some reason, a lot of those trees just have a branch that goes way out this way. And so the tree is unbalanced. You kind of want to bring that back in. So if you have a tree that, you know, is unbalanced, that you got one branch that's growing way too far out, you want to bring it back in. I noticed when I started with the city a year or so ago that Edison has been, you know, doing their line clearance thing, but they haven't been doing any, what do I want to call, shaping or structural pruning of the trees. And I'm seeing branches going from the tree way out towards the house. So I got this long, heavy branches heading out towards the house because that's where the energy is going, because Edison's been topping it. And we need to be bringing those back in because those branches, the chance of them breaking is pretty good. So I think they've thinned too much out of this picture. This is out of the book, so I kind of wanted to show you. It gives you an idea what they're doing in terms of inner branches, trying to thin it out to open the tree up. Any questions at this point? Yes. Yeah.
This is about two things you said not to have. So, two things. When you have the co-dominant,
right?
Which I have on a tree, is there anything that can be done to keep, not to have to cut one off? And then secondly, when you have a branch that's bigger than 3 inches, what do you do after something put on it? Has that been, what do you do?
Well, if you have to cut it off, you have to cut it off, but you don't put anything on it. I've got a slide on that later on, but no, they have found that, it used to be people would put tar on the branches. They have found that the tar acts like a little greenhouse, and now it's hot and humid underneath the tar and perfect for disease to grow. In terms of those codominant branches, again, if they're large enough and you don't want that big of a wound, you don't want to cut one of them off. If it's a small young tree, you can cut one of them off because that's ideal. But if it's larger, like you're talking, my suggestion is you reduce the amount of foliage on one of them. You choose which one you want, which then begins to starve that one, and the other one will eventually outgrow the smaller one.
Even on it's a fully grown tree.
Without saying it, it's hard to say. Yeah. Sometimes you do need to do that. You need to drill in and put a cable in it.
Since we're recording this, we ought to use this microphone, and I should have passed it around earlier. So would you be willing to repeat the question that was just asked?
Sure. So the question that was asked is, what do I do about a mature tree that's got that codominant? Do I go in and take one of them off? And I'm saying, no, you don't want to remove one because it's creating too large of a wound that'll never be able to heal itself. So if you can, you're better off reducing the amount of foliage on one of them so that eventually the other one will take over and become the more dominant. If the tree is really old, really mature, sometimes cabling it is better, putting either a big long bolt through it or actually cabling it to hold it together. Got it? All right. So in thinning a tree, we want to keep the shape of the tree, or keep the shape of any plant if we can. We just want to take out inner branches, again, branches that are crossing, branches that are too close together, so that we're going to open it up. So if you look at the difference in the two of these, the one on the right has the same shape, but you can see where the branches that are not quite as dark are the ones that they had or were proposing to remove. I always say a good pruning job, you should not really notice that the tree has ever been pruned. You know, and of course we have to raise canopies of trees, raise them up sometimes just in order to get vehicles by, or views, or clear stoplights, or whatever. But, oh, this is the one. But in raising them, there are some trees, and the example I'll use is a California pepper tree, because it drives me crazy. So if you got a California pepper tree and you have two branches coming out like this, and this one's hanging really low, the tendency is to go and cut this one off. And then you have this ugly cut in here, at least I do, because then you can see it. But if you cut the upper one off, California pepper trees then raise up. And a lot of trees will do that. So see how the tree reacts to pruning. So if the branch is going to raise up because you took the upper branch off, you never see the cut from the upper branch. Again, you don't want to look and see that the tree was ever pruned, but yet you still get that clearance. I know this isn't a pepper, but I forget where I was. I did some training in Guam, I think, or Saipan or something. So this is where, okay, you raised it up, but you waited too late, and now we've got these large pruning cuts, which then weaken the tree. Disease can get in there. And I think we talked about reducing the canopy. I don't know, there's much more to say on that. So when they talk about cleaning trees, oh, I know what I was doing. Now I lost my thought, now I'm back on it. So if I go this way. So we were talking about the different kinds of pruning. So in mature trees, we want to get rid of the dead branches, any that are overextended. If we need to reduce some of the foliage for wind load, we do that. And then that restoration that I talked about. And then cleaning a tree out, again, is just going in and getting rid of the dead, diseased branches, anything that's crossing, rubbing. And that's about the only pruning that mature trees need. And this was the thing about painting tree ruins, where they have found that it causes more harm than good, so we don't do that. I will say, though, when I prune roses, I put Elmer's glue on it to seal it, so. Something different. Okay, where are we at? All right, so your beginning steps is you want to stand back and you want to look at the tree or the shrub and say, okay, what do I want it to look like? What's my objective? What am I trying to do here? And when it responds to the pruning cuts, what's it going to look like in another 5 to 20 years? And then you start selecting the branches and the stems that you want to remove based on that idea that you have. And I just put at the bottom, you know, if you're trimming, or if you've got a tree that's around electrical wires, I think you need to have a professional that's trained into that, because that can be hazardous to your health, I'll say that. So I always ask yourself before you make any cuts, you know, what is it? Why am I cutting it? For what reason am I removing the branch? And I think this is the last slide. So one of our famous experts in the field says proper pruning is one of the best things that can be done for a tree. Improper pruning is one of the worst things that can be done to a tree. And that's my slide presentation. We're going to play around with this tree, but I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Just a moment.
Oh, that's right.
If you have a question, I'd like to bring the microphone to you.
You haven't addressed the subject of pruning fruit trees.
I have not, and I thought about that, and I decided that that's a whole nother class.
Oh.
I'd be happy to do it, and if that's why you're here, I apologize. I was thinking about that, and I thought, wow, that's just a whole different animal, because what can I say? So you have, for example, a plum tree that has these little spurs on it. If you cut the little spurs off, that's where the fruit gets formed on the tree. So you don't want to do that. The same with an apricot. Whereas if you take a peach or a nectarine tree, you want to reduce that down to probably, maybe a quarter of the length of the branch, because the fruit comes out along the new growth, the new buds that come out. And so you want to reduce the height of it. You almost look like you're topping it, but it's because you don't want a lot of fruit on the tree, because then you end up with a lot of little fruit, or you end up with the branches breaking because it's too heavy. But yeah, it's really is a science. I'd be happy to come back and do one on pruning fruit trees.
I was specifically interested in pomegranate trees and whether it's true that second growth is what produces the next seasons.
Yes.
And, how do you determine a water spout from a second season fruit bearing? And also what's going on with our citrus, and should we be pruning off all of this leaf curling stuff? Thank you.
My pomegranate tree is a real challenge. I mean, every year it puts on all of this growth, and it's a lot of pruning to go in and thin it out and make it look like something. But I always seem to get fruit, so I don't know, I guess I'm doing something right. But even those long sucker growths that come out in the pomegranates, the next year are going to put fruit on it. So I don't think you can do harm with a pomegranate. Citrus is a whole nother story. We've got what they're calling the citrus greening disease. It's now entering Southern California. They found it in Riverside, I think, a month and a half ago. It's a disease that basically destroys the fruit. It's the disease that wiped out citrus in Florida. It's carried by an insect. And so you'll see the ag people, they're putting out little traps all over the place on citrus trees, trying to see what's going on. They don't, I mean, what they're trying to do to protect the citrus industry is they're using a lot of chemicals. And those of us that are trying to go chemical free, it's a tough thing. Do you try and protect your citrus by constantly spraying them? Because what you want to do is you want to spray the trees, keep an insecticide on the trees, so that if the Asian citrus psyllid that carries the disease, you want to kill it as soon as it lands on the tree. You want to kill the insect before it infects the tree. So that's just a whole nother sad game, but they're applying an awful lot. I mean, one thing about citrus, at least, with that thick peel, it doesn't, the insecticide doesn't damage the fruit. It's not like an apple with a thin skin on it that an insecticide ends up getting into the actual meat of the apple. Which, another thought on that, if you're going to buy a fruit-bearing tree, what am I trying to say? The difference between a peach tree and a nectarine tree, everybody goes for the nectarines because they're easy to eat, right? You don't want a nectarine tree, and you don't want to buy nectarine fruit because the insects go after that soft little skin on it, whereas the fuzzy peach skin keeps the insects away. I know, and it's like, darn, I like nectarines. So, yeah, so I planted several peach trees and said, shh, goodbye nectarine. Any other questions? I'm sorry I didn't help you out with your citrus or your fruit trees.
I have a question. We have an oak tree, and it was treated for a shot hole borer.
Yeah.
And somebody had told me that actually weakens the oak tree, because as they inject the material around the tree, a dead area is generated where they've done that injection, and you're really reducing the strength of the tree. So does that make sense? And what should we do about
It makes
shot hole?
sense, but I think that's kind of an over-exaggeration. Certainly, they drill a hole into the tree, and that's where they inject the chemical, and then the tree takes the chemical up. That hole has to heal over, so that there is a dead area in there, but the tree is able to heal over that area. Unless they're putting too many holes in it and overly injecting it, I don't think it weakens it to the point of being a problem. Unless the tree is already under attack by the shot hole borer, then it could have a negative impact on it. But
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be a tough question, but I can't help but notice the tension between Southern California Edison and those of us who own trees. And I guess, I mean, fundamentally, there's an infrastructure problem where our electrical wires are going through the air instead of underground. What's the best way to handle this? I mean, as someone who, is in charge of the urban forest, so to speak, you must have a daily interaction with Southern California Edison or other utility folks.
Yeah, you get me started on something. I can say that I stopped about a year ago, I forget what it was, on the Edison trimmers, and screamed about what they were doing. And he said, "But I'm a certified arborist." And I said, "Then you should know better." And his answer was, "They're not paying us enough to do it right." I can tell you two stories. Whether either one of them would ever work, I don't know. I used to work for Claremont many, many years ago. And when I did, I had an agreement with Edison that my contractors would trim the trees and not Edison's contractors. And I don't remember the exact dollar amount, but we paid a little bit more to our contractor to trim the trees right. And so, if for example, if Edison's paying $29, which I think is what they do, and I had to pay $69, Edison gave me the $29, and I chipped in the other $30 to $40, whatever it was. When I worked for the city of Riverside, I took all of the line clearance away from the electric company, because Riverside owns its own electric, and I managed to lobby and kind of sweet talk them into letting me do it. And so I was able to use, I shouldn't say this, but at any rate, I was able to use not taxpayer, but electric payers' dollars to do a complete trim on a tree, which helped out my general fund tree trimming budget. I don't know. I've talked to Edison a couple of times recently, and they don't seem to want to move. They've been hammered so much with lawsuits that they're really less willing to try and let someone else take over line clearance.
So now they just need to be sued for trimming badly.
Works for me. So, yeah, it's very frustrating because they could trim the trees properly. To me, at least I think in Claremont, taxpayers, ratepayers would be willing to pay more to have their trees trimmed right rather than to have the line clearance people come in and just whack them off. Yeah.
Other questions?
All right, we ready to look at this poor little thing? I wonder if it'll fall over if I set it on here. Okay, so what do you see in this little guy? There you go, that's the biggest thing. So you've got this one here and this one here that are about the same size. So which one would you take off?
Your left. No, if you take off that one, then the whole tree sort of going that way.
Where it's V.
So you would take it off down here?
Oh, I don't know.
So if you kind of, not that you would do this with a big tree, but if you kind of pull it apart and you kind of say, all right, if I take off this one, this side is going to be pretty bare. And if I take off this one, that side's going to be even barer.
Yeah, if you take off that one, you actually take off most of the tree.
So what should we do? Suggestions?
Can you take off that one and sort of stake it up so it's a little straighter? I don't know.
It's more than 45 degrees though, so you can't just.
Yeah, you could do that.
I don't know. Or maybe, can you trim this one back without taking it all the way off? And
That's what I would.
get that one to
That's
go?
what I would do.
Yeah.
I think I'd take it down to here.
Yeah,
Are we okay if I do it?
yeah.
We won't
That
cry.
sounds good to me.
So we still kind of have the fullness, but we've reduced it. And again, as I was saying, this branch on this side now isn't going to have as much energy, so this one will outgrow it and eventually fill that in. So what else do we want to do with this thing? This one? So if you want this to be the main leader, you want to reduce the size of this one. Which I agree with that. What else? You got a lot of inner crossing branches you want to open up. That's a little dead one down there that got broken. And another one here. I got to clean the mess up, don't I? So we have some in here. And another one here. I got one right up here. Well, I was looking for a common name on it, but it didn't have it. But it's what they call an hemophilia. It's Australian, kind of an Australian bush tree. They're fairly new on the market. I think they get to be, I'm not sure this particular one, but they get to be maybe 6-8 feet tall, something like that.
Well, there's some crossing ones up top, I can't see, but up in there, up where it looks kind of thick. No, on the other side. I may not have the right, but they may not actually be crossing. Yeah, over in there, it looks like there might be some.
So I'm looking at this one here.
Rolling back into the middle.
So I'm looking at this one here, and I got this one down here, which are kind of crossing. So how do I make a choice on to which one I want to keep and which I want to remove?
The one that's on the one we're trying to reduce.
This one here.
Yeah. Because that's the one we're trying to discourage.
But now this one is still crossing.
Or maybe you want to
So we want to get rid of the one that's going up in the middle, and probably the one over here. Now remember, this is a young bush, so we're taking more out of it because we're trying to do structural pruning than if it was a mature. So remember, we want the lower branches to feed the trunk. So you go in and you just kind of nip them off. This one is almost turning into a significant, what we would call scaffold branch, so we really don't want that. So we're probably going to take it way back.
Why don't we want it?
Well, if, depending on what you want this eventually to look like. But that's a main branch and it's really low, so it'd always be really low to the ground. So if it was in an area where you were going to walk under it or you wanted some kind of clearance, you would want to take it off. Otherwise, if you were looking at this as just being a large shrub-like tree, you might want to leave it on because you want the lower branch. So I was just thinking if we cut it back, that'll take the energy and let it feed the.
Now, would you eventually later take that whole thing off?
Then later on, you take the whole thing off, right?
Now, on the one we're trying to discourage, there's one long branch coming up.
This one?
Yeah, I would have that, personally, I would have it back a little bit.
Does everyone understand what we're, so we've got, I don't know if you can see, so you've got the one we're heading back, you've got these long branches that are almost the same height as everything else. So we want to reduce these two down. And again, we want to say, all right, where do we want the energy of the branch to be going? So we either have this one, the energy is going to come out here, or we've got one to go over there. We prefer this because it's going to be a more open area. And this one, I kind of like the little branch down here because it'll grow out this way. Again, it's small and it's young, and you're trying to do structural pruning. I wouldn't know. If this was something mature, I would say, no, I don't want to do that to it. But we're just trying to open it up. I think they get to be anywhere from 6 to 10 feet, depending on which one it is. I kind of like them. They're new on the market. I was actually looking at them for Foothill Boulevard, but decided they were all too big. I wanted something that was more like 3, 4 feet tall, and I couldn't find one. Which one? Beside.
Somewhere in, no.
Well, we got this one that's going into the middle.
I was looking, I don't have the whole 360 angle, but yeah, something, it looks like some of those in there are going into the other ones. Yeah, that one.
Yeah. So see, we've opened it up. We've given it some better structure.
Do we need any soil amendments at this point?
No. Actually, it looks like it's got good stuff. Questions? Has this class been helpful? What could I do different?
I have a question for the audience. How many of you would like to have another lecture on fruit trees? Well, that's very popular.
Okay, I think I should have done fruit trees first. Well, you let me know what works for your guys' schedule.
I certainly will, and thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.